The first thing Graham Mercer saw that morning was 20 black Range Rovers blocking every road around his tiny house, their engines humming in the pale daylight, while armed-looking security men stood beside every vehicle. His 6-year-old daughter, Elsie, was still asleep upstairs, and Graham had no idea that the exhausted woman he had allowed to rest in his spare room had just brought the most powerful family in the county to his doorstep. He stood frozen behind the front window, staring at the convoy, until the woman appeared behind him with tears streaming down her face. She was no longer wearing the rain-soaked coat from the previous day. She looked terrified. And before she could explain anything, one of the black vehicles stopped directly in front of Graham's porch. If you believe that one act of kindness can change a person's entire life, please like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue bringing you stories about kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. Graham had never considered himself brave. He was simply a tired father doing whatever he could to keep his little family together. 3 years earlier, his wife had died after a sudden illness, leaving him with a 6-month-old daughter and a mountain of unpaid bills. Graham had once worked as a skilled automotive mechanic in a busy city garage, but after his wife's death, he moved with Elsie to a small countryside property inherited from his grandfather. The house was old, the roof leaked whenever it rained, and his battered pickup truck had more rust than paint, but it was home. Graham repaired farm machinery during the day, fixed engines for neighbors, and sometimes worked until his hands were too sore to close properly. He never complained in front of Elsie. To her, he was still the strongest man in the world. One afternoon, while Graham was repairing an old tractor engine in his shed, he noticed a woman walking along the roadside. She looked completely out of place. Her expensive shoes were muddy, her coat was soaked, and she carried a small leather bag that looked far too valuable for someone walking alone beside a country road. A damaged luxury car sat several hundred yards behind her with its hood raised. Graham wiped his hands on a cloth and approached cautiously. The woman explained that her car had broken down, her phone had died, and she had been unable to find anyone willing to stop. Graham looked at the darkening clouds and then at the house where Elsie was doing her homework. He knew he had little space, little money, and almost nothing to offer, but he also knew what it felt like to be completely alone. He fixed what he could on the woman's car, but the damaged part required tools he did not have. When the woman hesitated to ask for help, Graham told her she could rest in his spare room until morning. There was nothing luxurious about it. The room had an old wooden bed, a faded blanket, and a small lamp that flickered whenever the washing machine was running. Still, it was warm and safe. The woman seemed stunned that a stranger would trust her without asking for money, identification, or anything in return. Graham simply told her that if Elsie were ever stranded somewhere, he hoped someone would show her the same kindness. That evening, Graham made soup from the few vegetables in the refrigerator and gave the woman the last piece of fresh bread. He noticed she barely touched her food. She kept looking toward the window as though expecting someone to appear. Graham did not pressure her. He understood that sometimes people needed kindness before they were ready to explain their pain. Elsie, however, quickly became fascinated by their unexpected guest. She showed the woman a drawing of her family and proudly explained that her father could repair almost anything. The woman's expression changed when she looked at the picture. She became strangely emotional, as though the simple drawing had awakened a memory she had spent years trying to bury. The next morning, Graham woke early and went outside to check the woman's car. But before he reached the driveway, he heard a deep rumbling sound. At first he thought it was construction equipment on the nearby road. Then another engine joined it, followed by another. When he reached the front gate, he stopped dead. Black Range Rovers were arriving from both directions, one after another, until the narrow country road seemed to disappear beneath a sea of expensive vehicles. Graham counted 10, then 15, then 20. Security personnel stepped out, communicating through earpieces while positioning themselves around his property. Graham immediately thought of Elsie. He ran back toward the house and locked the front door. His heart pounded as he tried to understand what was happening. Then the woman walked downstairs. She had changed completely. She was no longer the frightened stranger from the previous day. Her posture was straight, her expression was filled with grief, and tears were already forming in her eyes. Graham demanded to know who she really was. For several seconds she could not answer. Then she finally revealed that her name was Vivian Carlyle, the only daughter of Everett Carlyle, one of the most powerful industrialists in the country and the chairman of Carlyle Holdings. Graham felt his stomach tighten. He had seen the Carlyle name in newspapers and on television. Their company owned transportation businesses, manufacturing plants, technology firms, and several charitable foundations. But what shocked Graham most was not her family's wealth. It was what Vivian told him next. She had not simply been stranded because of a mechanical failure. She had been trying to escape from her family's security team after discovering that someone inside the company was stealing millions of dollars and manipulating her father's business decisions. She had left without telling anyone because she no longer knew whom she could trust. The convoy outside was not there to punish Graham. It was there because Vivian's father had spent the entire previous day desperately searching for her. When his investigators traced her last known location to Graham's property, the entire family security operation had descended on the house. But there was another reason Vivian had brought them there. She had discovered something about Graham that even he did not know. Everett Carlyle had been investigating a decades-old business dispute involving Graham's late father, Colin Mercer. According to old company records, Colin had once been one of the most brilliant mechanics and engineering designers working with Carlyle Holdings. Years earlier, he had created a revolutionary engine component that saved the company from bankruptcy. But Colin had been accused of stealing the design and selling it to a competitor. His career had collapsed, his reputation had been destroyed, and he had left the company in disgrace. Graham had grown up believing his father had made a terrible mistake. Vivian explained that she had recently discovered the original engineering records. Her father's company had not been stolen from. The opposite was true. Someone inside the company had stolen Colin's invention, altered the documents, and framed him to hide the theft. The person responsible had eventually become one of the most powerful executives in Carlyle Holdings. Graham's father had spent the final years of his life believing that nobody would ever clear his name. Graham could barely process what he was hearing. The woman he had sheltered had uncovered the truth about the father he had spent his entire life defending. But there was more. Vivian had discovered that her own father had recently learned about the deception and had been preparing to correct the record publicly. Unfortunately, before he could do so, the corrupt executive had attempted to destroy the evidence. Graham looked toward the convoy and felt anger rising inside him. For years, his family had lived with shame over something his father had never done. Yet Vivian was standing in his humble kitchen because he had given her a room without asking who she was. Graham realized that if he had turned her away simply because she looked wealthy, frightened, or strange, he might never have learned the truth. Then the largest Range Rover stopped near the porch, and an elderly man stepped out. Everett Carlyle was thinner than Graham expected, walking slowly with a cane. He approached the house without his security team surrounding him. His face carried the exhaustion of a father who had spent years carrying regret. When he saw Graham, he removed his hat and lowered his head. Everett admitted that he had failed Graham's father. He had trusted the wrong people, accepted false evidence, and allowed Colin Mercer's reputation to be destroyed. He had spent years believing the lie because admitting the truth would have meant accepting responsibility for what happened. Now, after discovering the evidence, he had come personally to apologize. Graham listened silently. He wanted to be furious. Part of him wanted to tell Everett that an apology could never restore the years his father had lost. It could not give Elsie a grandfather she never knew, and it could not erase the humiliation Graham's family had endured. But then he remembered the woman who had stood alone beside the road, frightened and exhausted, and the reason he had opened his door. He finally told Everett that forgiveness did not mean pretending nothing had happened. It meant refusing to let someone else's mistake control the rest of his life. Those words broke something inside Everett. The powerful businessman began to cry in front of the security team, admitting that Graham had shown him more humanity in one day than he had shown Colin in decades. Everett then made an unexpected offer. He wanted Graham to return to Carlyle Holdings, not as an employee but as the head of a new independent engineering division created in Colin Mercer's name. He wanted Graham to finish the work his father had started. The position came with a salary large enough to transform Graham's life, but Graham initially refused. He did not want charity. He did not want his father's name used as a public relations gesture. He wanted the truth. Everett agreed. He promised that Colin Mercer's name would be formally restored, the stolen invention would be credited to him, and the corrupt executive responsible would face legal consequences. More importantly, he promised that Graham would have complete authority over the new division. Graham finally accepted, not because he wanted wealth, but because he wanted Elsie to grow up knowing that her grandfather had been a good man. Months later, Graham's life looked completely different, but he remained the same man. He still repaired small engines for elderly neighbors who could not afford expensive mechanics. He still kept his old pickup truck because Elsie insisted it was part of the family. Their little house was repaired, but Graham refused to turn it into a mansion. He wanted Elsie to remember that kindness had started there, in a modest home with a leaking roof and a spare room. Vivian also changed. Before meeting Graham, she had spent years believing that money could solve every problem and security could protect her from every danger. Graham taught her that real security came from knowing whom you could trust, and real wealth came from having the courage to do what was right when nobody was watching. She became deeply involved in the foundation created in Colin Mercer's name, helping families facing hardship and funding scholarships for children of struggling workers. One afternoon, nearly a year after the convoy had surrounded Graham's home, 20 Range Rovers returned to the same property. This time there was no fear. There were no investigators, no tension, and no secrets. They arrived carrying employees, engineers, families, and community leaders for the opening of a small community workshop Graham had created beside his old garage. It offered free mechanical training to young people who could not afford college. As Graham stood outside watching Elsie cut the ribbon, he looked at the old spare room through the window. He remembered the frightened woman who had once slept there, the broken-down car, the 20 vehicles that had terrified him, and the apology that had changed his understanding of his own father. He realized that the biggest turning points in life rarely announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive disguised as a stranded stranger, a broken car, or a simple decision to open your door when you have very little to give. Before the guests left, Vivian handed Graham a framed photograph of Colin Mercer. Underneath it was a simple inscription stating that a good man's legacy cannot be destroyed by a lie. Graham held the photograph close while Elsie stood beside him. For the first time in many years, he felt that the weight he had carried since childhood was finally gone. If this story touched your heart, please leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe Graham's greatest act of kindness was, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Graham never became obsessed with the money, the company, or the 20 luxury vehicles that once surrounded his little home. He remembered something much simpler. When he had almost nothing, he still had enough kindness to offer one frightened stranger a safe place to rest. That small decision changed the course of several lives, restored a father's forgotten honor, healed an old man's deepest regret, and gave a little girl a future built on truth instead of shame. And from that day forward, Graham taught Elsie the lesson he had learned the hard way: sometimes the door you open for someone else becomes the door through which hope finally enters your own life.